These slides are available online. Please feel free to get them. Actually, it's just go to slideshare.net, Josh Long, and you can see where the Spring Batch Bootcamp slides are. They're up there. That's my email and my Twitter handle. And the reason that's important is because if you come to this talk and then leave more confused than when you came in, at least you'll have recourse. Please feel free to reach out to me, send me an email, ping me. I'll do my best to help with not just Batch, but anything related to the Spring frameworks. My name is, I'm the Spring developer advocate for SpringSource, so this is kind of my shtick, so please feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to be honest, a lot of these slides are classic, timeless slides that the good Dr. David Sire created, the originator of the framework. So if you've seen a presentation on Spring Batch, invariably you've used or seen some slides from this deck. Author of 4 books, working on my 5th, which is the Cloud Foundry in Action book. It's for Manning. That one right there with the kangaroo, the tree rat, that's free. So go to springsource.org and you can /Roo and you can download the book if you're interested in learning about Roo. O'Reilly has graciously agreed to give it out. Okay, so the reason we're here, the reason we're all in this room, this is an article from Computer Weekly from the faraway time of 2000, and it describes the inadvertent overpayment of 112,000 basically Social Security payments in the UK, right? And it was all due to and I know most of you are thinking, well, what's the problem, right? There's 112,000 people got more money, good deal. But it describes a very real problem. It's a problem with batch processing. Something went wrong on their mainframe, and there was a glitch in the system, and there's suddenly a lot of happy people in England, So that's why we're here. Batch processing is hard. It's tedious. It needs some sort of de facto standard, something that keeps it in line and frees you to worry about what's important to your business as opposed to all the other housekeeping minutia, right? So, concepts, we'll talk about demos, we'll talk about specifics. Feel free to raise your hand. I've got so much to talk to you about, so we're going to kind of blaze right through this. So, obviously, how many of you, by the by, have used Spring? Just curious. Groovy. How many of you are using Spring Batch actively? Oh, good. So you'll benefit from this introduction. Basically, you've got your infrastructure. You've got the platform, the service tier on which you're running. And then at some point, you need Spring Batch's component model, which sits on top of Spring, which in turn insulates you from the underlying infrastructure pieces, so you don't have to care about that stuff, right? The component model itself is very, very flexible. So that's why Spring's got this very famous, much vaunted portability, and that bubbles up to Spring Batch as well and to other frameworks that sit on top of Spring. And then, of course, you've got your application. So, easy layering. But having said that, Batch itself is just a bunch of libraries. It's a little unusual in that, unlike most of the other Spring projects, it also has a storage component. It requires data to be persisted somewhere, preferably externally, right? So you can audit the progress of your batch jobs. When you build an application, the application works with the API, right? That's what you're going to deal with. Very, very cleanly, finely tuned, exposed API. That in turn will run on top of the execution, and that talks to the infrastructure, right? Infrastructure in this case is going to be Java, of course. Just by the show of hands, how many of you are doing COBOL or Kix? Oh, okay. Well, the dirty little secret is that, from what I've found working in financial services companies, is on the first floor you've got these young green Java people, and they're happy and ebullient and excited about life. And then on the floor above them, you've got the grizzled graybeards working on COBOL, and they make more money. And there's a reason. It's because that's hard. Batch processing is freaking hard. So I want to point out this doesn't run on Kix, but it does replace a lot of what you would do with COBOL and Kix. Batch itself, pretty easy to understand. Your entry point will be a job launcher, which will in turn be used to launch a job, and the job is composed of steps. The job itself can have job parameters. Once you have launched a job, you're given back an instance of a job instance. So there's that split, there's that schism between the definitional, the job, and the step, which is like the prototype, and then the runtime version to that. It's like a function, right? You can define a function, and then you can call a function with different parameters. Very, very workflowy. So once you've got a job instance, that's the handle you're going to use to be able to audit what's happening with your job itself at runtime, right? You can ask it, you can give it information that's specific to your batch run. Maybe you have a thing that runs every night at 2 p.m. or whatever, or a.m. Or you can also ask the execution itself, what's happening with the specific run of that job instance. So for example, if you've retried a job, it'll have 2 different job executions, right? That's why that's important. We retried one failed job that ran at 2 a.m., right? That's the idea. So this, reinforcing that hierarchy, that schism there, right? You've got the definitional and then the prototype and then the runtime. So when you're working with a job at runtime, you're going to have job instances and job executions, and this brings up a problem, which is what happens to data that I need to be unique per run of my job, right? Remember, in Spring, everything is prototype scope by default, and then we have all these neat other scopes for other things like web and session and so on. Well, it stands to reason that we need some way of scoping data to each job, or rather to each step of a job, and that's called the step scope. It's a very interesting technique. Okay, so having explained the basics, let's actually look at a simple Spring Batch application, just to get that out of the way. So I've got this code. Like I said, it's the code itself is on github.com/ github.com/Josh Long / Spring Batch admin. Spring Batch bootcamp. So please feel free to grab it if you haven't. It's a decidedly simple batch application, but you'll see what's happening. Oh, we need Wi-Fi. Come on, Wi-Fi. What is it? AT&T meeting? And is there a password I need? No. Groovy. Come on, Wi-Fi. It's a batch job. Well, normally I'm not going to actually depend on my network for the rest of this talk, but really? There you are, guys. So grab this code if you're interested. Simple Maven project. Okay. So by the way, I'm using the SpringSource tool suite. This is for those of you. How many of you are rocking Eclipse? Eclipse developers? Okay. This is the SpringSource tool suite. It's a freely downloadable distribution of Eclipse from SpringSource. It's got integrations for Spring and Spring Batch and Spring integration and so on. And it comes together with all the Cloud Foundry plugins. Even if you're not doing Spring, which is a shame, but even if you're not, you can download it as SpringSource tool suite, and it'll have all the tedious plugins and add-ons that you would set up on a regular Java EE distribution of Eclipse and spend hours trying to debug and get the right versions aligned and all that stuff. This comes pre-arranged, so it's just a nicely integrated, well-tested distribution of Eclipse, no matter what. Sorry? Yeah, it's great for Groovy on Grails as well, absolutely.
The great thing about for Spring Batch, you get a visualization aspect.
Hey, don't get ahead of me.
Sorry, in the ref part.
Insensitive Claude, gosh. Oh, no, he's right, though. There's a great integration for that, we'll see. But not right now. So, okay, I've gone through the lengths of writing 4 classes for you guys. This shows the commitment that I care. I do. 4 classes. So, and a definition file. So we'll start with the definition first. Let's see. Oh, gracious. I should have pre-expanded those before I came in. So this is my job. Can you guys all see that in the back? Yeah. It's a little, well, it's simple, right? That's the beauty of the namespace, right? It describes what you're trying to do very naturally. You guys can all see that, yeah? Yeah? We'll get into it. I'm gonna work through this, but basically that's your job. You've given it a name. You've told it where to store the data in the job repository. Store the data regarding the runtime state of the job itself. And your job itself can have multiple steps. And then steps, in turn, can either have TaskLits or other, we'll talk about other things that it can have in there. But basically, your composition is, one job to n steps, right? This is pretty simple. The namespace makes it very simple to use. I wonder if it'll work here. You can look at the visualization view. There's a batch graph tab there at the bottom there. In this case, it's a little underwhelming, but it's pretty useful, right? You can actually visually look at how the flow of your job's going to go. I have a whole bunch of beans that I needed to be able to set this up because there is a complex runtime model that has to be persisted. So I've configured that all using Java configuration. I've got this class over here. How many of you guys are familiar with Java configuration? Okay, well, basically in Spring you have the XML files. The XML files describe beans. Those bean definitions get interpreted by Spring, which then manages those components at runtime, right? Well, it turns out that if you want to define Java objects, using XML is fine, but you know what else is really good at defining Java objects? Java is pretty good at defining Java objects, it turns out. So we have this Java configuration mechanism, right? So when you see @bean, read that as a bean tag in XML. The class is the return type, and the ID of the bean is the method name itself. So this is just a definition in XML that looks exactly like what you'd think, and we're actually constructing the object ourselves. We can call the properties, and we can do if-then statements and do all that stuff. And then the return value is what's actually returned to Spring. So Spring is going to see this @configuration class. You're going to pass that to your application context, and it's going to call these other methods and create your beans for you, right? Same thing as you would do in XML. And here's the kicker. You can actually, the property ref, the idea of having a property value and then saying ref equals some other bean. Well, in this case, we just need a reference to it at runtime, so we just call the method. Spring will actually intercept that method call, run the bean that you've requested through the entire lifecycle itself, and give it all the guarantees that all Spring beans enjoy inside the container, and then return to you the fully initialized reference. If you call this method 10 times, you still get the same one reference, just like you would with XML. It works the same way. So very, very, very powerful, and it happens to be my favorite way to go. Neither choice is right, by the way. I just like, spreading the gospel, talking about the Java. So yeah, this is the gist of it, right? We've got the job launcher. We'll look at these beans in a bit, but the important bit is I've got a reader, which is going to read information from a flat file. I've got a parameter, which I need. This is the file that is going to be used to read, right? I'm going to read from this file itself. And that file will get changed every single time I run this job. So that's why it's it's scoped to this job parameters key, right? This is that step scope I was talking about. And then I'm going to, I'm actually constructing the whole flat file input reader, or item reader rather. I can specify how to tokenize the lines in the file itself. I can actually tell it the columns in the CSV file. I can tell it to convert the columns into Java objects using just regular kind of reflection. So the column called last name gets converted into a last name field on an object. And then I can map those lines. And then, the result is I've got a fully working customer object, right? A record, a POJO, all just by configuring this. You have a zillion different permutations here. You can specify tab delimited, comment delimited. You could specify whatever, right? Very, very, very powerful stuff, and it's just about knowing where and when to mix them up. Finally, I've got something that actually takes each customer. So again, the reader is going to read, and then the processor is going to get the record itself, and its job is to take the input, which is the customer, and then return something else, which is this second type. It can be another customer, or it can be something else. You can do a transformation, right? So that goes back to this job, right? Now you can see what we're talking about when we say reader, processor, and the writer. The writer is important too. Going up. Here, little writer. Come on out. There you go. So this is a JDBC writer. So I'm going to take that record coming in from the reader. I'm going to process it by just printing out some information, and then I'm going to write it to the database. All this code is stuff that comes with the framework, so I just have to configure the right beans for the right job. Here I'm saying I want you to use my own SQL, and I want you to use this bean property item SQL parameter source, which is going to convert a POJO into records into a table, right? So it's going to convert first name property into a column called first name, etc. So if I run this thing, you can see, here's my little public static void main. Spring Batch, by the by, works fine in any environment that Spring works in. So you can run it inside of a web container. You can run it inside of public static void main. You can run it anywhere, right? But a lot of people run these kind of things as backend jobs, maybe autosys or cron, or maybe you just use Spring's scheduled annotation or Quartz. There's a lot of places to start it. So application context, you can see I'm actually pointing to a configuration class. I'm telling it, go ahead and scan all the components in that package. I've got a job launcher, which I'm getting from the context. I've got my job itself, which is what we define in that XML. And then I'm giving it a parameter. I'm saying, I want you to read in the data from this CSV file. Remember, this will change per run. That's that scope I was talking to you guys about. And I'm going to create my job parameters using the job parameters builder. I'm going to say I want input file to be equal to that string I've got up here. And I want the date to be equal to new date, just because I need it to be unique across runs. And then I run it, job launcher.run. And I use the parameters in the job, and I am returned a job execution. Right? We'll go through the details on this, but I just want you guys to see a fully working example. Once I have the job execution, I can actually ask it its status. Be aware that this job execution you might have 1 million records, right? That's the whole point. It's a batch process. It might tail off and take an next week for it to finish. Have no fear. It'll stay alive. It's fine. It knows how to do the right thing and stream through the data. But the point is, you need to be able to ask it, so how you doing? You know, what's going on? Where are you? So here I've got a little loop where I'm asking it if it's still running. Any questions?
Is that synchronous, or do you get control back there and you can ask the status, or you're blocked until?
So that's what I'm saying. You can. This is asynchronous, but that's because I have you can specify the threads, right? So if you launch a job inside of a web container, you can't afford to have it blocking. You can also specify it to block. So here I'm actually asking it I'm actually getting the status and so on. Next question.
And it keeps its state, so like what happens if the server crashes?
So again, that's all going to be stored in a database table. We'll look at that right now. Let me see here. So I've got my, oh, no, you don't. No, you don't. Let's see.
If your job execution, you can set a connection pool using the standard job 5 concurrency
Right.
package. Basically, Spring has a wrapper on top of that, so you can set up the concurrency thread and pool size and all that, and then just associate the job with that thread.
Where is that set up?
Oh,
That can be set up in the config file. This is standard Spring config for
true that.
your execution pool.
So I just ran this thing. You can see it did everything it's going to do. It started up the actual job, and you can see printout. This is the processor I showed you guys, where I'm converting each record into going through this data, the CSV file. I've got name, value, I've got key, last name and first names. I just want to read it in. It's nonsensically simple, just 10 or 12 rows, whatever. And I want to read each one into a custom object and then persist it to the database. If we go to my little database, which is H2 in memory right now, bless you. Oops. Curious. Hold on a tick. The IP I had before is no longer the same IP, and it seems to have lost its mind. Bin, H2, bin. Okay, goody, customer. There we are. Oops, so I'm going to delete that thing, delete. From customer. Okay, nothing up my sleeves, blah, blah, blah. Run the job again. This time with gusto. There you go, same work. So now the data got persisted, right? Again, not the most interesting example, but you can kind of see the interplay, the exchange between components. We'll go into the details. I just want you guys to see what this kind of looks like. Data comes in, do some work on it, data goes out. Everything else is the details. Right? It's the heart of batch processing. Yeah.
Customer is the end point of this data, right?
Well, I read the data from a file, right? You saw that CSV. I want to work with it in terms of a data type. I don't have to. I can just work with it in terms of a collection of strings, like a map, or a result set, actually. But because I'm working with it and I want to be able to call my own domain model services and all that stuff, it would be nice to have a real statically typed, type-safe reference. So I use Spring Batch to convert it into a customer, automatically. And then I can work with that in my processor, right? If you're writing your own writers and readers, this can also be very useful. So yeah, you don't have to, I'm using a customer, and then by the time I get to my writer, I'm actually going to undo the work I've done in the reader. I'm going to convert my Java object into database records. And you saw I had configured that in the JDBC batch item writer. Okay. We'll get back to that, and we'll reference it as we move on to this talk. Come on. Okay. So again, job, lots of steps. Each step has an item reader and a writer and a processor, and they're optional, right? I think you can just have an item reader, which, can't imagine that being useful by itself. But if you have an item reader and an item writer, or an item reader and a processor, or an item reader and a processor and a writer, a lot of power there. Typically, I plug in something that Spring Batch already has for my readers and my writers. There's already a lot of them. I don't need to write my own usually, unless you have some sort of different use case that we haven't thought about. And then there's also support for retrying the jobs, right? The repeat bits, and also for intercepting and doing the right thing based on whether the job succeeds or not.
So,
Yeah.
are you going to go more into that?
Yeah. Well, retries, we'll get into some of it, yeah.
So we're just talking more about error handling. So let's say, where does the information go, right? Because ideally, like, if I declare an error on my customer object, I want to be able to persist it so I can retry it. But
Right.
I'm not going to put it into the customer table because it's
No, of course, doesn't belong there. So that goes back to that runtime state I was talking to you about. Batch step execution. These tables, by the way, these SQL files, they live inside of Spring Batches. Let's see, whenever they are. Well, they live inside of the code for Spring Batch. You just install them. There's like a dozen of them, one for each type of database. And then you install it, and they create these tables: batch job execution context, batch job instance, batch job params, etc. Right? So these are tables that you have to install somewhere.
sure. But so where's the data going to be written, right? It's like ideally I want to be able to process my file just once.
Yep.
And so if, let's say, it's 100 different lines, of which 5 fail, those 5 lines are persisted somewhere so I can retry.
That's what I'm saying. Oh, sorry. You're going to ask these tables information about that. Spring Batch itself will know which job, and then it creates a unique key for all the parameters that you use when you launch the job. So we used a different date in the same file. It created a different key, and that's why we have multiple jobs here. If you try and launch the same job twice with the same parameters, it actually won't let you. You need to specify. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it's, you kick off the job and you set up chunk size, so your transaction boundary, so in a million records, you can say, I want to process 100 at a time. So
Yeah.
That 100 block or chunk would be, all or nothing. What Spring Batch does, it stores it in there's actually a cloud column or a blob column in one of those tables where if it fails, it stores that chunk. So the file gets processed once, it stores those chunks, and therefore recovery. When you use the batch admin console or query the tables yourself and restart that chunk,
Yep.
or resubmit that chunk after possibly doing manual intervention or whatever needs to be done. But that's what happens. So it does each chunk, records the status of that chunk, and then if you fail, it'll keep that chunk of data in there so you can recover at some point.
That's a good point. Yeah. So it is. If you're asking about specifically the threshold for recovery, it's at the chunk level usually. Usually you're going to say, I don't care if I lose 5, but I do care if I lose all 1 million of them. So go ahead and forget about the last 5. I can roll back, and you can specify the granularity there. You can say I want everything to fail if one thing fails, or I want all of it to succeed, or whatever. How much am I willing to lose? Okay, so going back to this. So again, that's the same example. Here's this. A lot of people ask about, well, what about scheduling. Does batch do scheduling? Well, it doesn't, right? Spring Batch doesn't have any concern or care about when you run it. You can run it on a job on cron, you can use BMC or AutoSys, or, as I like to do, just stick @scheduled on a method inside of Spring, and then specify a cron expression, and the method will get rerun, assuming you've enabled schedule : annotation driven in your Spring configuration. So this method itself will get run every 15 minutes past business days, Monday through Friday. Past the hour every business day, Monday through Friday. And then you can see I'm launching the job just like before. So I'm getting a reference to my job execution and my batch status. I can ask it questions, and then finally get the job instance. Or, and this is going back to what Gordon was talking about, I can use the Spring Batch admin. The Spring Batch admin is a concession to the fact that developers don't control everything at the company, much though I would like to think we do. There's those operations people, those people who don't, those people who could really use a shower, those guys, They need help. They need to sleep easier at night. They're the ones whose beeper goes off when something goes wrong. So they need something more than your public static void main. Let's see. So Spring Batch admin, it turns out, is remarkably simple to get set up. If we had more time, I would show you that you can go to SpringSource tool suite and go to Spring Template Project and then click on Spring Batch Admin Web App. But since we don't, I'm just going to show you this, which is it already running, right? So here it is. And once you've gotten it created and you've set it up on your local project, it's just a web application. You can launch the web application, and it in turn deploys all the jobs that are defined in the configuration files in the Spring Batch configuration that's in the WAR. So here I've got, yeah. Can you cancel a running job? Yep. So here are the API, and here are the URLs you can visit for all the jobs. Right? I can say here are the jobs that are created by Spring Batch admin. Say I wanted to create a job here, and it takes a parameter, so it's going to give me a field to input the parameters, right? I know that I need parameters. So in this case, this parameter is designed to show you what happens if it fails versus not. So fail equals true. Hit launch, and you can see it's actually running, started. It's going to fail though, so it failed. And you can see what actually, the information you got, the auditability and all that stuff. Step executions, I can actually look at, this is the money shot here, guys. Commits, rollbacks, reads, writes, all that stuff. It's all stored here, and then you can see the actual, what happened. In this case, this is designed to fail. There's a step in there that's going to throw an exception and demonstrate it failing based on that parameter. Yeah?
A lot of slides back, you showed us a little bit of the configuration of the batch job or steps.
Yeah.
I don't think you mentioned, although I might have missed it, how kind of complicated can that set of steps be? Is there a parallel execution?
Yes.
Can they get big and fat and nasty and nested?
Yep.
Do they frequently?
So there's a whole sort of mini workflow language that's available to you for routing from one step to another. So say you've got one step that reads from a file and then converts to a database, and you've got another step that goes through that entire database and does some sort of accounting on it, and then you've got another step that actually writes the results to an audit file or report used for offline analysis. You can have all three of those as part of one big job. And then inside of each job, you have as many steps, and the steps can have chunks. So you can say every 100 records do X. And so yeah, you can conditionally route to other steps based on exceptions. You can tell it to route to other steps based on information that you have at runtime.
Conditionals in there?
Yeah.
And the dependencies in those steps, is that based upon explicit, like, these things are parallel?
So by default it's serial. You can specify thread pools, task executors, and those can be used to run things concurrently. But again, it's up to you to specify what is intrinsically parallelizable. Not all things are parallelizable and shouldn't be. Yeah.
With error handling, you did a step level or job level, so you actually manage the configuration itself.
So at the step level, you have error handling. At the job level itself, you have the ability to ask it the question of, how are you doing? What's the status of this job? Spring Batch is going to catch things, and it's going to report it as an error and keep it inside the database. So it's not like you ever get an exception that bubbles up all the way to the top. Well, I've never seen it anyway. Is that what you mean?
White out the customs, you have the error, we want to get somewhere else and then on the table or something.
Oh, there are interceptors. You can actually specify listeners for each step execution listeners, and you can say, okay, give me a feedback based on something. So I can actually grab that and do something else. But anything to add?
Yeah, there's really good stuff in the Spring Batch in Action book. I reviewed before, and there's a good section on error handling and the level of granularity. So it's you can pretty much take that at any level. And so it's a pretty easy thing to do with filters. And if there's exceptions that you don't care about, you can configure that so that if as part of the batch step, if an exception is thrown, like you can say, hey, if it's a deadline exception, we tried n number of times, right? But if it's let's say part of the process of emails and there's an email exception, well, let's just skip it, ignore that one. Right? You have a lot of granularity in terms of the exception processing as well as ignoring and failing on specific ones, retrying on specific ones.
Yep.
There's a lot of tweaking that you can do with configuration.
A lot, and it's big picture first, and then you get into details, and you can see there's every use case you can imagine. There's a reason giant companies like Spring Batch has actually helped process like billions of dollars. There's billions of dollars worth of value that has gone through Spring Batch successfully, which I think is a pretty interesting fact. So anyway, these are the two books that I would definitely check out. Were I you, going back to Gordon's point, we'll get back to them later if we ever we're clearly not going to make it all the way to the end. What?
You treated the other books. So.
No, I didn't. I have, nope. But I'm actually a fan of the Manning book. It's good stuff. Good stuff. Oops, go back to here. So, any more questions on Spring Batch admin? This little puppy? Again, it's the, yeah?
So this is nice if we are showing something back but if this needs to be integrated into an enterprise quality, option system. What are the options?
Well, again, at the lowest level, it depends on what your language of the integration is and so on. At the lowest level, all this information is being persisted to a database. And that's all this Spring Batch admin is doing, is it's giving you information that it's plucking from this database. The APIs that you see for executions and so on, job instances, job executions, step executions, that's all coming from this table. So that's the interface point to find out what's going on with the batch job. So if you're using C or .NET or whatever, and you want to get access to it, your common delimiter there is going to be SQL, RDBMSs. If you have access to the Java API, then of course you can ask it. You can actually use the listeners. You can do whatever you want to fire off audit events, for example. But there's all sorts of hooks. A common scenario is Sarbanes-Oxley. Those of us who live in the United States are under the auspices of Sarbanes-Oxley, which demands that all publicly traded data is auditable and traceable, right? So Spring Batch, of course, is imminently aware of that use case and very good for it. There's got to be a way. I'm not sure what your specific use case is, but there's all sorts of places to do it. You okay?
Yeah.
No?
One more follow-up question. So the defined steps that a job needs to take, is there an ability to change this process, like while the batch job is still running? In other words, can I change the flow of my job?
At runtime, you mean an existing job instance or a new one? You can deploy two concurrent versions of the same job, and subsequent runs will get the new one.
An existing job instance.
No, I wouldn't. Now you're looking at kind of there's no way to decommission a job while it's running, monkey wrench with it and then redeploy it and have it resume that I know of. I bet if you mucked with the tables enough, you could do it, but you're starting to get into that scary region that makes people like me drink water,
The answer is you probably can't do it, but
Yeah.
it seems a little risky.
Good luck. I mean, it's like doing heart surgery on somebody who's running. Hold still. We'll be fine. It could be done. I don't. All things can be done. Okay. Well, where are we? So yeah, bless you. A little bit about the basics here before we close, amazingly. Item readers, you can write your own. There's a bazillion of them in Spring Batch. The interface is simple. It's responsible for reading one T, whatever T is, right? So if you're reading from a file or a database or whatever, it's going to be one of those T's. If you look at, like I said, I wouldn't recommend you start by thinking you're going to write your own item reader. You go back to here, and you go back up here. You can see, come on, introduce. There we go. So here's the type, and you can see all sorts of Command T, lots of options out of the box. You got options here for JDBC cursor-based readers, stored procedure readers, Hibernate, which is another one of those icky, mucky, disgusting, exceptional cases where you got to be careful because Hibernate itself has these weird issues with flushing and boundaries and so on, but it can be made to work. iBetas, JDBC, JPA, flat files, Hibernate cursor, stacks XML files, like if you want to stream through a giant XML document. And all these things are designed to do the right thing, for n records where n could be a zillion records, no problem at all. So JMS, by the way, that's also a very good one. Yeah, lots of different types of readers. It's more than likely you're going to find something that you can use. But if you really wanted to write your own, if you had some sort of input, service that you want to integrate with, you just provide your own implementation of that class. Right? So let's see. Skip that. We're running short on time. You can see that the XML and the how it does it is kind of up to each reader, but you pick a natural boundary. In this case, XML is going to work on fragments. It's going to work on an expression that matches a certain stanza. The database itself is going to match the SQL expression, etc. Flat files, this is the one that a lot of people ask about. Flat files, it turns out, has this very rich API specifying how each flat file reader should work. So the flat file reader you can specify how it tokenizes, how it breaks it into columns and so on. And that's all specified by these by these interfaces that you can plug in. There's a whole bunch of useful ones out of the box, though. Field set mappers. This tells you how to map a map, basically, how to take a key value pair, several key value pairs that you got from reading in a file, and then mapping it to something that's important to you. For example, a domain model object. So here I'm saying, given a field set, which is just basically a map with keys and values, where keys are the column names and values are the values in the column. Give me, tell me how to convert it into a trade. You can also do it by column name, right? That's the map access, intrinsic, the idea of mapping. Let's see, item processor. This is the next guy in the chain. Same interface. You can provide your own. This is usually where usually when I approach a batch job, this is where I'm going to do something specific to my business use case, right? I'm not gonna rewrite the world and rewrite my own readers and writers, but if I wanted to, I could. The processor itself is where you get the chance to say, okay, I've got a representative record from the input source, whatever it is. And I've used the converter to convert it into the domain type I want, and now I want to process it. So I'm gonna be given an input, and it's my job to return the output, and then that'll be forwarded on to the writer, right? Let's see, which looks like this. And again, lots of item writers. The item writer itself, you note that the item writer itself is going to be given a list of T, right? So that while the reader reads in one at a time, it's expected to write in chunks to the output source. So if you have 10, if you specify 10, then you're going to get 10. You're going to get a list of 10 or less records if it gets to the end of the resource.
So just to clarify, so it doesn't necessarily process all the items one by one. You can say process 10.
Yeah, well, that's what you're doing right here. So it doesn't do it one by one. It'll read it one by one. But
If you look at the reader API, it's a single.
Yeah.
Right? So you read as many times as you chunk. So if you say, I want to process 10 records at a time, it will read 10, put those in the collection, push them to the processor, and you use it. It's really only for validation for the most part.
Yeah.
And then pushes it to the writer, which takes that entire set. And
that's the commit interval. You specify. It's a Java library. You just start it up wherever you want.
What I'm saying is, I'm running the job in one JVM.
Yeah.
If I want to take each of those chunks and process them in different
Oh, so Spring Batch actually has the ability, there's a proxy step called it's a remote execution step. I forget the specific partitioning, and yeah. It uses this, you get to a step, and then that step, all that's gonna do is communicate to some other node and delegate the work. So you can actually do things in concurrent across a node. The default integration that used to be, I mean, still there, but the default integration that comes inside of the code for Spring Batch Admin uses Spring Integration, which is an integration framework, and it uses the channels. So whatever Spring Integration can connect to, including JMS, JDBC, AMQP, Mongo, Redis, I mean, anything, whatever, and web services, whatever Spring Integration can connect to, because you're just using that API, it can ferry the work, it can communicate the work to these other nodes using those channels, and then it waits for the response coming back. So you have one job running here, but it's like, you got your own little MapReduce, basically. It's actually very, very powerful. Yeah.
So, follow-up question to my previous one. So let's say you have a reader that takes 10 clicks, and then you said you have a processor interface, and that's where you would do error handling? So let's say like...
No. Well, that's where you're going to do the... Keep your code as singly focused and concerned on the things that are important as possible. The processor will do the validation. You might do your math. Like, say you have a job that goes through and updates all the prices to 10% because it's Christmas. Screw the bastards, right? Go ahead and do that in the processor. You get all the records. You get a chance to do the math on all the records and do the math and update it, and then that'll be forwarded to the writer, which will update the database. See what I'm saying? Or the resource that you're running to.
So for example, like I'm reading in 10 things, and then making some decisions whether the data is ready to be written.
Right. If you return null on that processor, that'll stop the chain. It won't be.
That will be done inside the processor.
Yeah. But error handling is a different use case. You would handle that. Again, by default, error handling will just be, the job will stop, and then it'll be committed to the data store, and you can actually ask it, or the Spring Batch admin, what happened.
Okay, so there's a difference between like sort of errors that, things that are unexpected.
Yeah.
I guess
Business.
sort of is like,
That-
is data ready to be written? Or
Exactly. Your semantic checks. Very, very different. And again, this is a reflection of the fact that you want to write the things that are important to you and no more. Let Spring Batch worry about whether it'll actually handle 1 million records and not get a memory leak. Let Spring Batch worry about whether it'll run safely, if you leave it for 2 weeks or a night or whatever, So yeah, this is that commit interval, by the way, we were talking about. Whoops. You can see there's lots of options here you can say how many times I want to retry. You can specify the policy. You can say I want to do a back-off policy where I want to retry by progressively longer periods. So try it again immediately almost. And then if that doesn't work, wait, a little bit more. And then if that doesn't work, wait a little bit more. Keep retrying it. And then you can say up to a limit. You can tell it the policy for skipping. So, whoops. This is where you can specify the policy and how many things should be allowed to skip before you consider it a failure. So how many rows you can read while still being satisfied that the job is worth marking as finished. So you have a lot of options, and that's all going to bubble up in terms of this namespace right here.
A quick question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to configure that to be a percentage of the data?
No. Yeah, that's a common question. I would just plug in my own skip policy in that case. You'll get enough information where you can do that.
You have to write a custom skip policy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
There's a whole skip policy framework.
Yeah.
Set of components you can register, build your own. You're not just doing standard
right.
counts and such.
I'm actually a contributor to this project. I really should just make it so you can do percentage. It's one of those things I hear a lot. So, but yeah. Okay. Anyway, so okay. Moving on. Or I guess we're not moving on. Yeah, we're not moving on. We're going to stop, coming to a dead stop. Aren't we done at 11?
We got 11:15, which is good.
Oh, good. Good. Rock on.
And we got 15 minutes before the next session.
Sweet nectar. I'm going to keep you guys all here. Item writers. So yeah, good. Here's an example of an item writer. Again, the writer itself might carry state. It might have an idea of what you're doing, and it might need parameters that are created from the job. If you define your bean in Spring and you give it a scope of type step, then that writer will be recreated each time you get to that step that needs to write. right? This gives you the chance to take in job parameters and consume them. So here I'm actually injecting the user home, and then if I had a parameter in the writer method itself, I can actually specify a value from the job parameters itself, like the file name that I want to write out to, for example. There are some writers that are not stateful, right? So you can use those as well, but be aware that you have to know which writers and which readers keep state. A lot of them are, you can create a singleton and just reuse the same thing over and over, but sometimes that's not always true. So here's an example of a flat file item writer, which is going to write out information to a file that I've created here, and you just set the resource, and then you're done, right? So it's going to write that out each time it gets to a step. JPA item writer, again, does exactly what you think it would do. It's going to write JPA data using a JPA API. Yeah, so this is actually going back to that point, right? Jobs themselves can have job instances. Job instances themselves can share item writers. So you need to know how that's going to behave if you have multiple instances versus just one using scopes. So item writers themselves are only created per execution as needed. If it's a singleton, then it won't be overcreated, right? So yeah, this is the revised version of a reader. This is again, we want to be able to get access we want to be able to access the data that's coming in from the job itself, right? The reader itself, in this case, not the writer, needs information about which files to read from, right? And that's unique per run of the job. So I'm saying at value job parameters input.file, and I specify a resource, and Spring is going to automatically convert that parameter and provide the value for me when this method gets instantiated, right? You can do this all in XML. You can just say bean class flat file item reader, and then you can specify the scope and so on that you need. Let's see. I want to get to the important bits here. There's the namespace itself. Here we go. This is the XML namespace. This is what you're going to deal with by default, right? You're going to set up the important infrastructure bits like the repositories to store this stuff and all that stuff, and data sources and transaction management. You'll set that up in regular Spring or using Java configuration, and that's a one-time thing. Usually you'll specify that once, and then from there it's just a matter of adding new jobs to your repository, right? You define them using the namespace. Here's a very, 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 very complicated, overly complicated example, just to show you every possible permutation of every option. Right, so I've got a step. It has a TaskLit, the chunks inside the TaskLit, specify readers, processors, writers, skip limits, and all that stuff. And you can actually see I've enumerated which exceptions are skippable. Right. So for example, if I get a flat file parse exception, then I can say I want to skip this record, just move on. We don't care, ignore it, and you'll actually be able to see which lines were skipped in the database. So you don't want to process like 999,000 records and then have it fail on the last one, and then you lose all your data, right? So this is very important to know. Just go ahead and skip. It's okay. Most jobs don't have big jobs of a sufficient size won't be perfect. You can also see this is that conditional workflow kind of stuff, right? Down here we have the ability to say, okay, the next step is going to be, step 2 by default, unless there's a completed with skips, unless the actual job itself completed with skips, in which case you should go to the error printer. Or, you should fail completely if the exit code of the step is failed. So a lot of different flexibility there. You don't have to specify all these different things, but you can see, you can route these things as you need. Questions on this overly complicated example?
So let's say you have a bunch of skips, right?
Yep.
But it's still data that you want to eventually report.
Yep.
Can you talk about sort of that case? Like, does the framework allow you to retry those skips?
Yes.
Know about those skips?
It'll know about it. It'll record it, but I haven't met a business case yet where the skipping that happened would be avoidable the second time. But if you really believe it's avoidable, then you can retry it, repeat, right?
And the follow-up question is, what's the development sort of procedure for this? Because like typically, let's say if you're trying to create some kind of data integration and a complicated import, it's a very iterative process.
So we hope with Spring Batch, again, exactly for that reason, Spring Batch is available, right? Nobody knows more, nobody knows better than I what it is to write a job that you think is going to scale to n items when it's only meant to actually scale to half of that, and then it runs. And so in your tests, you do n items, you test 1,000 or 2,000, but then you get to a job with 1,000,000 and it falls over because of memory, right? And that takes a long time to weed out. So you can, as long as you specify the right options here, hopefully you can, it'll certainly scale, it'll certainly handle all the load, and in terms of responding as gracefully as you'd like, you specify the options here. Just know about your toolkit at this point now, because we're hoping you don't have to spend a week waiting to unit test your batch job, right? It should just be easy to plug it together and.
Yeah, that wasn't my question. My question is more
Oh.
like, so let's say I'm starting to receive files.
Yeah.
And initially, for the first month, I only know how to handle 80% of those files, but the 20% is still, I would like that to be sitting in the queue, so that once I'm sort of able to get through the issues, I can still re-upload.
You'll have ability to access which lines were skipped on the database, and you can retry the job, or you can just resubmit a new job with those lines. I mean, it's at some point the human operator is going to go in there and say, okay, all these lines need to be redone. I'm going to submit new jobs. The cleanup case.
So Spring Batch, like in case of the skips, it will record the lines.
All of it. Yep.
The skips, so I can then have access to it.
All that stuff lives in these metadata tables. So it has complete state and it knows what it's doing at runtime.
And are there any gotchas there? Like, let's say if I have 20,000 of these skipped records, like I'll still be able to go back and retry them?
Yeah, but hopefully you don't get 20,000 skipped records.
I mean, it's a legitimate use case, right? Because
Yep.
maybe at first I'm only processing a portion of my feeds, but I know I will need to catch up to the rest of the feeds. Like I process utility data, and maybe I can process electric and gas, but not steam. But I know I'll eventually get to steam or sewer or whatever.
Yep.
So
At some point,
we'll persist that and sort of if that.
this is only assuming you have a custom skip policy, going back to that point. Again, when you get to 20,000, that, depending on how large your data set is, I mean, you have a threshold which by default you're going to specify in terms of the skip policy. If you say it's more than, you can say, okay, well, you should go ahead and not skip, even if there's 20,000 of them that fail. You'd have to specify that in the job. It would have failed long before that otherwise, right? So you have to make sure you have to tune it to be able to skip that many,
So skip policy means that the job will still succeed if it skips 10?
Yes, but it'll note the exceptions. It'll note the failures.
It will note.
Yeah. Okay, let me run through this here. Resource management, this is up to you. This is, again, Spring Batch does a good job of maintaining the state for resources that it reads from and writes to. It's important that it does the right thing, cleans up state, cleans up resources, closes transactions. You can trust that we're building on top of the idiomatic Spring APIs that you've come to know and trust, like the JDBC template and so on, and the Transaction Manager SPI, Platform Transaction Manager hierarchy inside of Spring. But that said, there's still some very crazy stuff that has to happen to make this stuff reliable so that it's basically bulletproof, So for example, say you've got a writer that's writing data, and the writer it's in a chunk, and it's writing to a resource that has transactions. So for example, JDBC, you can say I want all 5 to be inside of a transaction. The transaction synchronization piece, which is actually a Spring framework piece, will try and write it. You write to the file resource, no problem, first case, and then you eventually write it again and again and again. The transaction is kept open until the chunk closes. Whoops, there you go. So finally you get to one where you have a, kabang, something goes wrong. It wets the bed and now you need to fix it, right? In this case, the transaction management mechanism is going to roll back and do the right thing for you. So you have a lot of, where appropriate, we do employ whatever heuristics you're used to, like transaction management, for example. Hibernate, I mentioned Hibernate in the flush policy problem. That's a very strange problem. It's very peculiar. So Hibernate has to flush. You have to flush data to get it persisted, right? If you in a given session. So if you open up a session, it's going to treat everything inside that session as one giant thing, and then you have to flush it to make sure that those things are made permanent. You don't want to recreate a new session each time you have a chunk. That would be just horribly wasteful. The other problem is that we have, we don't have any ability to tie what happens inside of Hibernate to an individual record, right? So this is where it gets very weird when you're using ORM technology with batch processing. ORM is not meant to do batch processing, so this is kind of a workaround. You can see what we can do. We can actually aggressively flush after every single write, that defeats the point of having chunk-oriented processing, right? We can search through the chunk looking for failure, so that if you have a chunk of 10, you'll pay the cost of looking for the error over 10 records, right? And a lot of this stuff is all wrapped up inside the Hibernate item writer. But my personal opinion is maybe just don't use Hibernate for this kind of stuff, you know? There's another use case here, which is, okay, so you've got a job that isn't so naturally mapped by input and output. It's not easily described in terms of reading in terms of chunks and then writing out in terms of chunks. Common use case is, okay, I've got a stored procedure. I just need to run the whole thing. One step, launch the whole step, launch the stored procedure, and then just wait for the confirmation code, you know? And that's, you need to be able to integrate legacy processes into your batch processing, obviously. We're not expecting you to rewrite everything. So a common example is that. Maybe a web service call. We have a web service. We have the ability to actually communicate with web services as well, but the point is, there's a lot of cases which don't map naturally into this API strategy. So we have TaskLit, right? TaskLit is what we saw in that XML namespace. Up till now, we've specified steps in the TaskLit, but you can actually just override it. You can exert control, and you can say, no, I'll go ahead and describe the TaskLit. I want the full control. I don't want to use your idea of steps. So it becomes very easy. And then it's up to you to, well, by default, the framework, but it's up to you to specify whether that tasklet should be retried, you know, should be continued, should be, you know, what exactly. If there's an exception, you throw it and it'll get bubbled up, and the framework itself will handle it. So this is the wrapper around those steps. We actually have a tasklet that lets you embed those steps in there, right? So it's a higher level approach, but it's more raw. If you want full control and you don't want to worry about steps, use this. So yeah, job steps, and then tasklets, and then chunks is what I'm saying. You don't want to worry about chunks. You just want to be able to say, I want to do everything myself. Then go ahead and plug in a tasklet. It works just like you saw before, right? Except now instead of having steps with chunks, you have just a tasklet. There you go. I mean, it's an integration point. It's the lowest point you can still play without actually having to write, you know, part of the framework. And you can specify transactional attributes and so on. Failure modes. So go ahead and just take a quick photo of that in your mind. This is why this deck is online, because I don't expect any of you to remember all this. But there are lots of different permutations of failure, and they're all well tested and well documented. But basically, based on certain kinds of events, you can expect certain responses, and you can see what you can do. Again, slideshare.net/Josh Long. Please check it out and grab that table if that's specifically what you're looking for. But that's actually a very common question: is what happens when I do this? Well, we sat and thought about it for you. There's a lot of different use cases, right? Chunk-oriented processing. So we talked about item-oriented, that's tasklets. Going back to the chunk-oriented processing and diving into it a little bit. Remember, chunk-oriented is the default. That's what we expect you guys are going to use. It's the more graceful, more powerful option. Tasklets are last resort. Chunk-oriented processing basically looks like this. No, this is, I'm sorry, yeah, this is right. This is reading, I'm reading records while more input, you know, reading from a resource. And then inside of a transactional boundary, if there's a transaction available, if I'm writing to JDBC, for example, then I'm going to go ahead and write in, I'm going to do chunks, right? Here's the, there's a specific use case for, okay, if I have an exception, and if it's not critical, then continue. Otherwise, go ahead and repeat that same flow and do everything we just talked about and handle the exceptions. Again, you get very, very specific power and fine-grained control here. And then chunk-oriented pseudocode itself, if you want to read more data, what you're going to do is you're going to say chunk is going to be equal to whatever many records you want to read in from the thing. Go ahead and read it, and then retry for each one, right? So you're going to write it out in chunks. Hopefully that was a whirlwind tour of all the features you can expect from Spring Batch. I'll take questions if you have them, but we're at the end of our little journey here. Yeah?
A quick question, is this inbound only, or if I wanted to read from the database and then read like a CSV file, is that possible as well, like outbound?
Oh yeah, we have all sorts of options for writers and readers. So you can read from a database, or read from JMS, or read from a file, and write to a database or a JMS or a file or XML document or whatever. There's all sorts of options. Yep.
So in the Spring Batch admin, do we have the ability to create new schedules for different jobs?
Again, the admin and Spring Batch itself doesn't have any idea about scheduling. So it's up to you to launch it, operator, you click on it. And if you're using like the add scheduled annotation inside of Spring Framework, you can specify that this method should be rerun based on a cron expression.
But you have to, that has to be deployed with a code. You can't do that from the admin.
Right.
Yeah, the admin is really a CRUD app for
Operators.
already executed jobs. Yeah, so you configure all the cron setting, or the cron or the the schedule settings inside of Spring. You have to build a different UI for that. I mean, Spring Batch admin is just a kind of a helper app, and really, I don't think it was originally intended to be this big thing. So it just
I just want to be able to,
Thanks. Yep.
not have to go to a developer and have to.
The retry semantics. So we could, like, if you want to pull a web service or hit, you can tell it to retry and keep. You can tell it just to keep retrying 10 times. Like if the website is down, so you actually have the ability to say there's actually a retry template, basically, and that's what you're dealing with. Yeah, and it's very by default. There's actually policies like it'll retry 2 seconds, then 4 seconds, then 6 seconds. Backing off, exponential back off, right?